After more than 4 decades of silence, she finally spoke. The wife of mega pastor Zachery Tims broke her silence, and the words she revealed have shocked the faith world. What she says now could rewrite everything we thought we knew about his legacy. Stay tuned, because what's coming next will change the story. For years, the name Pastor Zachery Tims carried both admiration and mystery. He was the dynamic, charismatic leader who rose from a troubled past to become one of the most recognizable figures in American ministry. His sermons filled megachurches, his television broadcasts reached millions, and his message of redemption gave hope to people who thought they'd gone too far to be saved. But his story didn't end on a stage. It ended in a New York City hotel room in 2011, under circumstances that left more questions than answers. And ever since that tragic night, one person has remained largely silent: his wife, Riva Tims, the woman who knew him best, the one who shared not only his rise, but also the heartbreak of his fall. Now, more than a decade later, Riva is finally speaking, not out of anger, not for attention, but to share the truth she's carried in her heart for years. A truth that reveals what really happened behind the bright lights, beyond the applause, and inside a marriage that was both blessed and broken. This isn't just another church scandal story. It's a journey into forgiveness, failure, and faith, and how a woman found her own voice after being silenced by pain. Because the truth is, while the world focused on Zachery's sudden death, few ever asked what became of the woman who stood beside him when the cameras weren't rolling. How did she survive the betrayal? How did she find strength after the headlines faded? And what finally made her speak now? In this story, we'll uncover the rise of a pastor who became a household name, the hidden cracks in his marriage long before tragedy struck, the shocking details Riva Tims has finally decided to reveal, and how her message today is forcing the church world to confront its silence around broken leaders. You won't believe how deep this goes, and how many layers of truth have remained buried until now. So, before we dive into what Riva has revealed, we have to go back to where it all began. Because to understand the courage it took for her to speak now, you have to first understand the pain she endured then. Before the headlines, before the megachurch lights and the worldwide broadcasts, Zachery Tims was just another young man from Baltimore trying to find his way. Born into struggle, raised in instability, his early life was marked by pain, rebellion, and bad decisions that would have destroyed most people before they ever reached adulthood. As a teenager, Zachery wasn't just running the streets. He was running from something deeper. The absence of stability, the hunger for approval, and the constant pull of temptation shaped his early years. Drugs became his escape. Crime became his comfort. But even in the chaos, there was a spark, a tiny, unexplainable awareness that his story wasn't meant to end in destruction. It was during one of those dark seasons that he encountered something life-changing: the grace of God. According to Zachery's own testimony years later, it wasn't a preacher, a sermon, or a church choir that brought him to repentance. It was an encounter he couldn't explain. Alone, in the quiet after a near-death experience, he said he felt something supernatural. That moment, he claimed, pulled him out of addiction and into destiny. From that turning point, Zachery became a man on a mission. He went from lost to found, from broken to burdened with purpose. He dedicated himself to ministry, studied theology, and soon developed a preaching style that blended raw honesty with electrifying charisma. People didn't just listen to him, they felt him. He spoke the language of the streets, but carried the wisdom of the Spirit. And that mix made him magnetic. When Zachery founded New Destiny Christian Center in Apopka, Florida, with his then-wife Riva Tims, the ministry grew faster than anyone imagined. What started as a small gathering of faithful believers exploded into one of the fastest-growing churches in the nation. Thousands came weekly, drawn by the promise of new beginnings, a phrase that seemed to reflect Zachery's own life story. Behind him stood Riva, elegant, composed, deeply spiritual. She was not just the pastor's wife. She was a co-laborer in ministry. Together, they were unstoppable, the model couple in the modern church era. Their chemistry on stage and their unity in leadership became part of their brand. He was the passionate visionary. She was the steady voice of grace. Their ministry expanded across television networks, streaming platforms, and conferences. Invitations poured in from around the country. They were featured in Christian magazines, praised for their authenticity, and celebrated for their impact on youth and families. But success, as it often does, came with a hidden cost. As the church grew, so did the pressure. Maintaining influence, managing finances, handling internal staff, it was a machine that required more and more energy to sustain. And slowly, beneath the public smiles and polished sermons, cracks began to form. Friends close to the couple would later recall moments of visible strain. They said Riva often appeared tired, while Zachery seemed distracted. He was traveling constantly, preaching in New York one week, Los Angeles the next, and across the globe the week after that. His schedule was relentless, and the more success he achieved, the more restless he became. But no one outside the circle suspected anything was wrong. After all, from the pulpit, everything still looked perfect. The Tims family was admired, their kids adored, their ministry thriving. To the world, it looked like a divine success story, proof that God could transform a life completely. Yet behind the closed doors of their beautiful Florida home, something sacred was quietly falling apart. Riva had noticed the changes. Subtle at first, but undeniable. The long phone calls, the emotional distance, the late nights that didn't add up. She later said in interviews that she felt something was spiritually off. She prayed, fasted, and tried to hold the family together, but deep down she knew they were slipping away from the unity that once defined them. The man who had once conquered addiction was now fighting a new kind of temptation, one that came disguised as success, admiration, and influence. The stage that once symbolized his redemption became the very place where pressure consumed him. And for Riva, that was the beginning of a heartbreak she could never have imagined. Because just when the church reached its peak, the truth began to unravel. The whispers started small, a rumor here, a conversation there. But in the world of ministry, secrets never stay buried for long. If the rise of Pastor Zachery Tims felt like a divine movie, what came next was the tragic twist no one saw coming. By the mid-2000s, New Destiny Christian Center had become a spiritual empire. Tens of thousands watched the sermons on television each week, and people traveled across state lines just to sit in the sanctuary. Members called Zachery a real one, a pastor who didn't hide behind religion, but spoke from pain, passion, and purpose. His ministry was powerful, but behind that power, something fragile was breaking. Riva Tims, who had stood beside her husband since day one, began to sense the emotional distance widening between them. The connection that had once been their strength was fading. She later said she felt like a stranger in her own home, watching the man she loved drift further away. At first, she believed it was just exhaustion, the cost of ministry, the burden of leadership. But the changes weren't just in his schedule. They were in his spirit. Those close to the couple recall seeing Zachery become more withdrawn, less accountable, and increasingly surrounded by people who fed his ego rather than his soul. Fame can be intoxicating, and for someone who had come from nothing, the attention, the admiration, and the access could easily cloud judgment. Then came the whispers, quiet, cautious, but persistent. Whispers about inappropriate relationships, whispers about emotional boundaries being crossed, whispers that slowly made their way to Riva's ears. She confronted him, not in anger, but in heartbreak. And according to her later testimony, that conversation was one of the most painful moments of her life. Imagine it, the man she prayed for, the man she built a ministry with, now standing before her, unable to deny the rumors. The truth was undeniable. There had been an affair. The public saw perfection, but Riva was living through devastation. She described that moment as feeling like my heart had shattered into 1,000 pieces. Still, she didn't run. She prayed. She fasted. She tried to reconcile. Because for Riva, love and covenant weren't disposable. She believed that even broken vows could be redeemed. But trust, once cracked, doesn't mend easily. And in the high-pressure world of ministry, where image is everything, she soon found herself living in quiet pain while pretending everything was fine. Eventually, the truth spilled into the open. The affair became public knowledge, and the very ministry they had built together began to crumble under the weight of scandal. The church, once a symbol of redemption, became a battlefield of opinions. Some stood with Zachery, calling for grace and forgiveness. Others rallied around Riva, demanding accountability and transparency. The media coverage was relentless. Gospel blogs, Christian magazines, and news outlets dissected every detail, every quote, every emotion. It was no longer just a private struggle. It had become a national conversation about fallen pastors and broken marriages in the church. Riva Tims filed for divorce, and while the paperwork was straightforward, the emotional separation was anything but. In her own words, she said, "I never stopped loving him." But love couldn't fix what he refused to face. After the divorce, Riva stepped away from New Destiny. She started her own ministry, Majestic Life Church, in Orlando, where she could heal, rebuild, and serve without the shadow of her past. Many thought she would fade quietly into obscurity. Instead, she emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to walk in truth. But for Zachery, the battle was far from over. Though he publicly repented and sought to restore his ministry, those who knew him said he struggled privately with guilt, pressure, and deep emotional wounds that never fully healed. Behind the suits, the sermons, and the smiles, there was still a man fighting invisible demons. People who saw him in his final months described him as anointed but exhausted, charismatic but conflicted. He was preaching about freedom while silently battling captivity, a war between calling and compromise. And then came the night that would end everything, August 12th, 2011. The news broke like a lightning bolt through the gospel world. Pastor Zachery Tims had been found dead in a New York City hotel room. He was only 42. The initial reports were vague, filled with confusion and unanswered questions. How did he end up there? Why was he alone? And what exactly had happened? Authorities later revealed that a small envelope containing a white substance, believed to be drugs, was found in his pocket. But even after all the speculation, one fact remained clear: a life that had inspired millions ended far too soon. The church community was stunned. Members cried openly in the sanctuary that Sunday. Leaders across the country expressed disbelief. And for Riva, the grief was unspeakable. She had lost not only her former husband, but the father of her children, the man she once believed would grow old with her in ministry. Despite everything that had happened between them, she still loved him, and she mourned him deeply. But even in her grief, Riva refused to let his story end in shame. In interviews years later, she made it clear that Zachery's death was not the sum of his life. "He was a good man who made bad choices," she said, "but he was also a man God loved deeply." And that's where her voice began to shift from silence to purpose. Because while the world judged the scandal, she was quietly learning how to turn her pain into a platform, not for gossip, but for growth. Still, even a decade after his passing, Riva Tims had remained careful, cautious, almost guarded about what really happened behind closed doors. Until now. Because recently, for the first time in years, she finally spoke, openly, directly, and fearlessly, about her marriage, the pain she endured, and the truth she believes the world never truly heard. And what she said sent waves through the entire faith community. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't bitterness. It was revelation. After years of silence, prayer, and private healing, Riva Tims has finally decided to speak. And when she did, it wasn't out of anger, nor was it to drag her late husband's name through the mud. No, this was different. It was raw, redemptive, and brutally honest. For more than a decade, people speculated about what really happened between Pastor Zachery Tims and his wife, about the pain behind their smiles, the truth behind the scandal, and the reasons behind his tragic end. But through all the rumors and assumptions, Riva stayed quiet. Until now. Her recent message wasn't just another interview or sermon. It was a heartfelt confession from a woman who had seen everything. The glory, the downfall, and the grace that followed. When Riva stepped to that podium, the sanctuary was silent. You could feel the weight in the room, as if everyone knew something powerful was about to be spoken into existence. And then she said these words, words that rippled across social media, into podcasts, blogs, and YouTube channels within hours. The truth is, we were both broken. I wasn't just the victim. I was also part of the story God had to heal. That moment stunned everyone. For years, the narrative had been simple. Zachery Tims, the fallen preacher, Riva, the betrayed wife. But Riva's confession reframed everything. She admitted that in the years before the scandal, their marriage had already been under tremendous pressure. Pressure from the ministry, from expectations, from trying to appear perfect when in reality, they were human and hurting. We were trying to save souls, she said, but we were losing each other. Those words hit hard, not just for churchgoers, but for pastors' wives everywhere who know what it feels like to carry the silent weight of public ministry. The pain of showing up to service every Sunday while your heart is bleeding. Riva revealed that even before Zachery's affair, their relationship had cracks, emotional distance, exhaustion, lack of communication, and the overwhelming burden of leadership. She said, "You can't pour from an empty vessel." We were giving and giving, but we stopped giving to each other. And then came the part no one expected. She spoke directly about forgiveness, not the easy kind, but the kind that hurts before it heals. People asked me how I could forgive him, she said. I told them I had to. Not because he deserved it, but because I needed to live again. In that moment, she wasn't just talking about forgiving Zachery. She was talking about forgiving herself, for staying too long, for breaking in silence, for pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. And for the first time, Riva also addressed the rumors surrounding Zachery's final days. She didn't go into graphic details, but she gave enough to silence years of speculation. He was a man fighting demons no one could see, she said. People saw the preacher, but I saw the pain. And I want people to know that addiction doesn't mean absence of anointing. It means someone lost their way while trying to find peace. The crowd was stunned. Some cried, some whispered, "My God." Others just sat in silence, absorbing the gravity of her words. She went on to say that even in his brokenness, Zachery never stopped loving God. He wasn't a fraud, she insisted. He was a man who preached what he hoped to become. But sometimes the pressure to be perfect breaks you before your promise is fulfilled. That single sentence, "he preached what he hoped to become," became one of the most quoted lines across the internet. It summed up not just Zachery's life, but the struggles of countless pastors who lead others while secretly wrestling with their own shadows. But Riva didn't stop there. She revealed something even deeper. Something she had kept buried for over a decade. She shared that before Zachery's death, the two of them had reconnected privately, not romantically, but spiritually. He had reached out, wanting to apologize. He told me, "Riva, I messed up, but I never stopped loving you or the kids, and I never stopped believing that God could fix me." Riva said that hearing those words broke her heart, not because of what was said, but because she knew he was still trying to heal, still seeking redemption. And then, weeks later, he was gone. That conversation became their final one. When she spoke about that moment, her voice trembled. If I had known that was the last time I'd hear his voice, I would have said more. I would have prayed harder. But I thank God I got to hear him say sorry. I thank God I got to say, I forgive you. That admission, that final forgiveness, changed how millions of people now view their story. Riva made it clear that forgiveness didn't mean erasing the pain or pretending the past didn't happen. It meant choosing to release it, choosing peace over punishment. God never wastes pain. She said, if I can help another woman heal, then my pain has purpose. Her message wasn't just about a failed marriage or a fallen pastor. It was about the redemption that can still be found in broken stories. It was about how even in tragedy, God can rebuild something beautiful. And the way she spoke, calm, confident, humble, made it clear that Riva wasn't the same woman she was back in 2011. This was a woman who had walked through fire and come out refined. She ended her talk with one final message that echoed across every pew and screen. I stayed silent for years because I was protecting what was left of us. But now I speak, not to expose, but to empower, because somebody watching needs to know your story isn't over. You can heal, you can forgive, and yes, you can rise again. Those words went viral. Within hours, clips of her testimony were being shared by gospel networks, pastors, and YouTube channels across the country. Hashtags like #RivaSpeaks, #HealingThroughForgiveness, and #Zachery Tims legacy began trending among Christian circles. What made this moment so powerful wasn't the scandal, it was the humanity. Riva Tims didn't come to relive pain, she came to reclaim her peace.